Adam's Last Days, by Gerhard Moll. The futility of his existence soaked through the borrowed anorak, crept slowly through his dirty, sweat-soaked shirt, breathed through his stinking underwear, lingered for a little while in his thin, sick body, gathered deep inside him, and left through his feet, unwashed for months, as a foul smell. This effluvium clawed at the fibers of his old socks and stained his worn-out boots with yellowish-brown patches. It was not only the stench of his feet by which one recognized him. The plaque on the quarry of his ruined teeth also gave off a sour, stale smell of wine, mixed with the breath of a habitual pothead. The muggy summer heat in the pub could not penetrate his thick winter clothing, and so it concentrated instead on his hair, unwashed for years, plastering it to his scalp and making the blackheads on his nose swell. These black dots were present in such numbers that one might have believed he had beard growth from his throat all the way up to his eyebrows. Because of the intense summer heat, he left the zipper of his warm jacket open, thus revealing a thin, washed-out t-shirt, sloppily tucked at the front, into a pair of light brown corduroy trousers. The fronts of these trouser legs were greasily worn at the thighs and artistically enhanced with a number of ink stains. This too-short garment ended where the dark grey terrycloth socks began, separating his sweaty feet from the half-high shoes to prevent them from sticking. His needy appearance, however, harmonized in a very particular way with his body odor, and seduced the unsuspecting into unconsciously feeling a suggestive kind of sympathy, almost pity. His brown eyes floated on a yellowish lake, were slightly clouded, and partly hidden beneath thick, bushy eyebrows. With almost 80 years of life behind him, he had become an experienced hunter, and pubs were his hunting ground. He saw himself as an undiscovered artist and philosopher. With this routine, he also had the greatest chance of selling his products to a man, or of getting free drinks. When he was short of cash, he would stupefy himself with an overdose of marijuana and a bottle of wine, then, in delirium, bend rusty wires in every direction and solder them together into bizarre shapes. He would then give the tangle of wire a name and think up an outrageous price for it, so as to leave himself enough room for negotiation. Shortly after nightfall, Adam set off for the village. It was time to make a bit of cash again, and the corner pub at the entrance to the village was ideal for that. As inconspicuously as possible, almost hesitantly and without looking around, he steered toward the long bar to the left of the entrance. A quick glance around the room had been enough for him to assess the situation, and he moved unerringly toward a free bar stool beside a tipsy tourist. The man sat there as if lost before a half-full glass of gin and tonic, an English-language newspaper beside it, staring with glazed eyes at the barmaid's plump backside. With submissive respect, Adam opened the conversation, and politely asked whether he might take the seat beside him. Joyfully surprised to be addressed in his own language, the stranger now examined Adam more closely, and tried in vain to place him. Obediently, Adam introduced himself as a local artist, briefly mentioned his London origins, and began laboriously searching in his nearly empty wallet for a few cent coins he had specially prepared for this purpose. "May I buy you a drink?" he began, and the stranger immediately saw that Adam's money might not be enough, declined with thanks, and after introducing himself as Mr. Smith, magnanimously returned the invitation. For one brief moment, something flashed in Adam's eyes. He made himself a little smaller still, and while he politely lowered his gaze a little, he said meekly, "Hello, Mr. Smith. My name is Adam. I am pleased to meet you." The spell was broken, and Mr. Smith was glad to have found an outlet for his bad mood. The stranger told Adam a great deal about his life, and after several hours of listening and dutifully agreeing, he proved very generous. Adam, as a practiced listener, knew how to make himself liked, also showed a few of his works of art on the tiny display of his old mobile phone, and politely thanked him for the drinks whenever his glass was almost empty. Mr. Smith magnanimously picked up the bill for both of them, and they arranged to meet again the following evening. Well drunk, Adam left the bar, not without thanking him once more for everything, and went to the next pub, glad to be rid of that talkative fellow. There he met his daughter Jasmine, who was in the middle of a group of Moroccans, gesticulating passionately, and was even drunker than he was. Jasmine was in her late 40s and looked as used up as if she had spent the last 30 years working in an oriental brothel. Well brought up, she hurried toward her dad and showered him with compliments about his magnificent appearance. Adam briefly informed his daughter about how the evening had gone, and about his plan to sell Mr. Smith one of his valuable works of art the next day. The expected windfall, however, was to be celebrated that very evening. Professionally lascivious, she nestled up to Abdul, a tall Moroccan without front teeth, whispered a promise into his left ear with her tongue, and he promptly ordered a glass of red wine for her father. The evening was saved, and now they could really get properly hammered. The night was long, the mood was good, and after the pub had closed, Adam staggered to his car. On the back seat of his little furgonetta, he intended, as usual, to sleep off his intoxication, let the construction workers wake him the next morning on their way to work, and then begin the day inspired by a joint. With Jasmine, the matter was somewhat different. The large amount of alcohol had only really got her in the mood, and now she needed male company. She left the bar with her Oriental acquaintances in the direction of the Moroccan Quarter, to finish herself off completely. One of her exotic acquaintances had occupied a small hut there. Since they had secretly tapped the neighbor's water connection the previous month, the level of luxury had risen considerably, and they now used this establishment regularly. A dirty mattress covered in stains lay on the floor in the middle of the room. Abdul had knocked out the wall to the toilet months earlier so he would not miss anything, and a musty smell pressed away from the kitchenette toward the floor cushions. These lay on the floor between the foot of the mattress and the hut's only window. An open fireplace with half-burned remnants of shoes, clothes and cigarette butts gave off a smell of wet ash and recalled yesterday's party. Jasmine immediately made herself comfortable, undressed, threw her clothes onto one of these cushions, and unashamedly visited the toilet. She was in her element when she felt the men's greedy looks on her naked body, and she posed expertly for the mobile phones with built-in cameras. The house party could begin, and morning was still far removed from the now. She laid a sheet on the old mattress, and made herself comfortable on it. Without embarrassment, she showed the Moroccans crouching on the cushions all her secrets and could hardly wait. They, however, were in no hurry, skillfully opened a bottle of rot-gut wine, and enjoyed the sight of their hot queen before agreeing on the order. Awakened by the laughter and joking of the passing construction workers, Adam sat down behind the wheel of his furgonetta and drove to the corner pub from the evening before. Here, in front of the bar, he could not leave his car standing any longer, since it was in a no-parking zone. Besides, he knew from experience that it made a better impression on the villagers if his car was not parked in the same place for too long. Now he urgently needed a large carajillo with cognac before driving home, allowing himself a joint, and sleeping again until the afternoon. The lively activity in the pub was hard on him, and he slowly became properly awake. Abdul and a friend of his daughter's from the previous evening, whose name he did not know, were standing at the counter and buying 2 bottles of wine. Sullenly he watched the two of them, and thought of his daughter. He would rather have seen her at the side of a well-situated Englishman, preferably a Londoner, than with these crooked types. Of course he was no racist, but he could not stand Moroccans or black people. They looked overtired and were conversing animatedly in their mother tongue, of which he unfortunately understood nothing, even though he himself had worked for 2 years in Adzilla's carpentry shop. He still remembered that time very well. The Moroccan mountain village of Adzilla was known for hashish smuggling, and there he had helped in a carpentry workshop, hollowing out pieces of furniture and preparing them for drug smuggling. It had been arduous, badly paid work, and he had experienced firsthand that these people could scarcely live from their drug cultivation. The thought of smuggling himself had occurred to him back then as well, but to make a little quick money, the risk had seemed clearly too high. He muttered a few sentences to himself as the Moroccans left the place and walked off toward their quarter. His daughter's car was still parked in front of the entrance, just as it had been yesterday. He began to brood and thought about the evening with Mr. Smith. The man had not only told him a great deal about his life, Adam himself had also confided a little too much about himself. Today he would meet him again, and perhaps get to know him a little better. The evening was promising, and now one more carajillo, this time with Bailey's, and then off home to take a little nap. When Adam arrived at the pub as arranged, there was no Mr. Smith to be seen. But since he was there anyway, so Adam ordered himself a small bottle of wine to make use of the favorable moment, and decided to wait. Time, of which he had plenty, spent with a full bottle, gave him a feeling of security. In earlier days it would not have been like that, but now, in old age, even half of it was enough for him, and he could keep his level at exactly the height he needed to feel comfortable. The rest he would later take home with him and drink there in peace. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Mr. Smith enter the place in the company of a woman, and sit down at one of the free tables. Indignation rose in him, and he took a large swallow to wash down this impertinence. This uncouth Londoner had overlooked him, and that despite the fact that he had wasted so much work and time on him. The bottle was half empty when Adam could no longer restrain himself, slid from his bar stool, and went to the table of the two of them. In Mr. Smith's eyes he could immediately recognize unease. His companion, completely overwhelmed by this situation, looked alternately from one to the other, and abruptly stopped her flow of speech. To diffuse the situation, Mr. Smith stood up and introduced the village artist Adam to his wife. Adam, pleasantly surprised by this turn of events, breathed a kiss on the reluctant lady's left cheek and right cheek, and then held on to the back of the chair opposite Mr. Smith, hoping to be asked to stay. Mr. Smith, however, had learned from yesterday's meeting with Adam, and did not make the same mistake again. Busily, he stood up, drew the artist a little to one side by the sleeve of his jacket, and spoke to him about his works. Now Adam saw that his hour had come and asked him to follow. Looking uncomprehendingly at the works of art in the trunk of the furgonetta, Mr. Smith could not decide on any particular piece, and compensated Adam for his time, and in order to get rid of him, with a banknote. Adam held the small note between thumb and forefinger with a look of disgust, until a larger note brightened his expression, and he felt sufficiently compensated. Relieved, both returned to the place, Adam to the bar, and Mr. Smith to his lawful wedded wife. The evening was saved, and Adam finished off the bottle. Satisfied with today's business, he went outside stiff-legged to his car and drove home. There he tormented himself up a small slope to the courtyard gate, awkwardly unlocked the padlock, and disappeared into his hut, grumbling to himself. A good friend had given him a handful of marijuana a few days earlier, and from it he now rolled himself a joint, to help him fall asleep and stimulate his imagination. After he had not even smoked half of it, the floor beneath his feet began moving backward, and he slowly tipped forward, face first onto the kitchen table, without closing his eyes. For several minutes he consciously remained in this position and stared stupidly at the empty bottles and glasses on the table. His eyes still slightly open, he fell into his dream world and suddenly found himself back in his childhood. London, Second World War. He took the boy by the hand, and they went up onto the flat roof of their house. His father's hand was strong and familiar, and nothing in the world could have destroyed that trust. He could feel that strength, just as he could feel the earth beneath his feet. So they stood side by side and watched the fireworks over London. Little fire-spitting fingers at the edge of the city raced into the sky, making sounds like the thunder of a heavy storm. Bombs fell from the sky, and aeroplanes howled with their loud sirens. So they stood on the roof, and he could feel his father's hand slowly growing damp and beginning to sweat. Many large balloons floated above the city. They were tied down with thick cables and prevented those fire-spitting dragons from flying even lower. Glowing red lances came down from the sky and bored into the streets, like the lightning bolts of a tremendous storm. The boy was so overwhelmed by what was happening that he went down from the roof with his father only reluctantly. As they had yesterday and the day before, they went into that strange half-round thing behind their house and spent the rest of the night there. Most of the neighbors also slept in these corrugated steel bunkers. Covered with earth, they looked like the entrance to a tunnel. Gloomy, damp and cold, Like a heart made of wet soil, they could be seen in almost every garden, and seemed to hold an entirely different meaning for the adults than they did for the boy and his friends. There they came over their houses and stabbed their flashing lances into the streets, and where they struck the houses, those houses collapsed in on themselves like sandcastles. Giant birds with propellers in their wings, fire-spitting, loudly howling, and he could see the fear in the eyes of the others. Amused, the boy turned away, for he had entirely different worries. His friends from the parallel street were gone. A bolt from the sky had probably struck them, and so tomorrow he would have to look around for other playmates. In the last years of the war he was enrolled in school, and this new phase of life took much of the little boy's carefree spirit from him. He was used to being allowed to laugh and talk whenever he wanted, to play when he felt like it, and roam around the houses with his friends. Now he sat in the last row of his school class, and did not quite know how he was supposed to manage, sitting still, and not taking his classmates along on journeys into the adventures of his imagination. This eternal urge inside him to communicate grew overwhelming, and the boy could no longer hold back the words that wanted to flow across his lips. Like a blow, a name hurled from his teacher's mouth, his own, struck the boy's ears, and the stream of words from his mouth dried up at once. Heat rose from his back, over his neck and into his head, and stiff as a stick he stood up reluctantly. The teacher stood before him like a rock in the surf, and his authority was so strong that he could smell it. As if from far away he heard the last scraps of his words. 3 strokes on the hand, and into the front row beside Jennifer. The eyes of everyone upon him, afraid of the pain and full of shame that he might perhaps shed a few tears, the boy stretched out his left hand. Hissing, cutting through the air like a knife, the thin bamboo cane struck the palm of his hand. His ears began to ring, and then the second and third blows found their mark. The fear that the teacher might perhaps lose count made him quickly pull his hand back. Just don't cry now, the little man thought. Anything but crying. With a red face and a burning hand, he packed up his satchel and sat down in the front row beside Jennifer. Softly she asked him whether it hurt very much, and as she did so, she took his left hand between both of hers. Still fighting the tears of pain and shame, he heard himself say, "No, no, not so much." He could feel her sympathy so strongly that a wave of security swept over him and made him forget the pain. During a break, she took a few bits of fluff from her sweater and from his jacket, mixed them together, and twisted them into a little ball. Her dark eyes looked deep into his as she asked whether he knew what it meant. "It means that we love each other," and those words came so beautifully from her lips that he would never forget them. The sounds of tipping bottles and shattering glass turned the young man back into Adam, with his head on the kitchen table. Laboriously, he stood up to sweep the shards under the table and finish smoking the rest. Strange, he had not forgotten the dream and grew sentimental. A few tears squeezed out of his tired eyes and moistened his scratched glasses. The memory of his childhood was like a lash across his soul and caused him to open a bottle of wine. He loved the smacking sound when the cork slipped out of the bottle, and its smell made him think of cozy hours. Beside the head of his bed, he carefully set the bottle on the floor and lay down on the old mattress to meditate a little. Consciously, Adam concentrated on the beautiful memories of his youth, slipped off his boots with his feet, and let them thump onto the floor. Confused thoughts raced through his head like a wild swarm of bees, and with effort his tired mind clawed at a few scraps of them, searching for an anchor. Inside his skull, it buzzed and roared as never before, his face felt hot, and the tongue in his mouth belonged to someone else, numb and dry. When he wanted to turn onto his side to reach for the bottle, Adam realized in fright that he could no longer move. The weak light of the candle barely flickered as he screamed out his fear, but no sound left his closed lips. A heavy weight pressed the emaciated body onto the bed, and pleasant darkness sent Adam once again on a journey into his past. Years passed, and the war was long over when, on the recommendation of Miss Eacock, his teacher at the time, his parents enrolled him at an art school. She was a beautiful woman, this Miss Ecock. Her medium-length brown hair, her beautiful breasts, and her concentrated femininity had captivated him. A new time began for Adam. His surroundings changed so quickly that he had difficulty keeping up. A new generation had matured and begun to question all old values and to consider life from a philosophical perspective as well. They were the forerunners of the hippies. Their aims were so entirely different from those of their parents, and a generational conflict opened up. Endless conversations with other students and a new direction in music and art became the expression of inner freedom and the pathbreakers for his further life. He still remembered well one of his teachers who kept telling him about Spain, his dream country. About the untouched expanses of that land, the heat in the south, and the lush green in the north, the barren mountains and the steppes burned by the sun, the Alhambra, the wonder of the world in Andalusia, and the modesty of the locals. Above all, though, about the possibility of realizing oneself there, of a freedom never known before, and of living without social constraints. Many years would still have to pass, however, before he could recognize his dream and then leave his homeland forever. It had never been his declared goal to become an artist. Adam used painting and drawing to express his feelings, and because in this way he found a path toward realizing himself. His true passion was philosophy and enjoying life in its causality. To marvel at each new day, consciously experience the positive aspects, and suppress the negative ones. This inner path of life had already unconsciously taken root within him when, at 17, he met Janice. She was simply enchanting. When he looked into her dark eyes and his hand glided over her beautiful hair, he would have liked to sink into her and her world. He was in love with this young woman. But, like so many things in this world, happiness with Janice was not granted to him. She was Jewish, and when things between them became more and more serious, and they had already spent almost 3 years of their free time together, the day came when she decided to speak with her parents about their love, which until then had been purely platonic. They then arranged a joint conversation with their rabbi, at which Adam was not allowed to be present. That was the end of their relationship. He was only briefly told that the two of them continuing to be together would not be approved, since he was a, quote, Gentile. He could no longer understand the world, nor did he want to. Only because he was not Jewish, their love had to die, and they were no longer allowed to be together. The pain and helplessness in the face of this arbitrariness almost robbed him of breath, and he felt excluded and humiliated. That this was done to him in his own homeland, and above all at a time when everything was striving for more openness and liberalism, hurt him. But he had to submit and swallow this bitter experience. Yet he firmly resolved never to forget Janice, just as he would never forget the circumstances that had led to their separation. Time healed this wound as well, and the pain turned into grief. Distraction came from the final examinations now approaching, and he graduated as a teacher of art education. Now he felt free of all constraints. School was no longer the center of his life. No exams, no regularity, and he began enjoying life even more than he already had. The confrontation with his father was only a matter of time, and after a few weeks, his father very emphatically advised him to leave the family home. In his homelessness, which had come upon him so suddenly, the last possibility was a friend's car, so he would not have to give in to his father after all. Well, it was rather harsh to taste the experience of being allowed to sleep in a car and not knowing what the next day might bring. Days followed days and became weeks, until the friend's mother took pity on him and invited him to live temporarily with the two of them in northwest London. He liked the surroundings, fitted himself into this new family structure, and greatly enjoyed the months that followed. Soon he was able to finance his life himself through the sale of his paintings, and rented an apartment of his own nearby. A few months later he teamed up with 2 friends, also art painters, and for 1 year they took another apartment, though in a better district. His paintings sold surprisingly well, and he was able to put a little money aside. Hardly had he become somewhat better off financially when the spirit of adventure overcame Adam, and so he hitchhiked to Portsmouth. Adam's days in Portsmouth were unforgettable. He stayed for a few days with two friendly whores, and experienced their trade, as well as the circumstances of their lives, at close quarters. Unforgettable were the nights in the girls' beds. They slept on the top floor of a house without a roof, with a clear view of the starry sky over England. It was Easter, damn cold, and he was glad not to have to sleep alone beneath the thin blanket. The time with the whores was beautiful and unforgettable. On the journey home, he met an enchanting girl in a small bar. Her name was Caroline, she had beautiful blonde hair, an enchanting smile, and she was more attractive and more beautiful than any girl before her. Every freckle in her face, her radiant laugh, the way she spoke, walked, moved, pleased him, and there was nothing comparable left in his life. She did not conquer his heart by storm. It was a hurricane. Only for her and with her did he want to be. They decided to stay together forever, got themselves a tent, and spent the next weeks in an unbelievable intoxication of feelings on the Isle of Wight. From far away they heard voices and the sounds of engines. It was a beautiful and, as always, cold morning. Nestled closely against her, he saw her breath leave her mouth as a little mist, saw how it grew thinner and dissolved. The voices came closer and became clearer. He could already understand a few scraps of words, when he noticed Caroline's body stiffen, and fear overwhelm her. Now he too felt that something was going to happen. "My father," she whispered into his face. Tears ran in small drops over her cheeks and seeped soundlessly into the pillow. Adam had to think of his own father and grew afraid. His shivering feet began to tingle. He grew hot. What if her father reacted the way his had? Panic inside him, nothing but panic, incapable of a single clear thought. He had to watch helplessly, as their togetherness was disturbed from outside. Simply by someone slowly drawing the zipper of the tent upward and letting their small, intact world vanish in the morning haze. It was her father, and he was not alone. The embarrassment seemed to have no end. Uniformed policemen had come with him, and before Adam understood what was happening, everyone was gone again. Everyone, and he was alone. He could still feel her warmth. Everything that mattered to him, even her warmth, was gone, simply no longer there. He had to cry without restraint and felt alone in this damned beautiful world. Quickly, Adam packed everything together, stowed it in the car, and drove back to London. The drive to London ended in a timeless tunnel. It grew dark, and no light could be seen at the end. Adam found himself back in his old, drug-ravaged body, tried in vain to open his eyes, and heard noises near him. Trapped in delirium, deprived of most of his senses and without control over his body, he wanted to draw attention to his predicament. But however hard the old artist tried, he could not move his numb body by so much as a single millimeter, and his eyes remained closed. Condemned only to hear, he was allowed to experience the most terrible hours of his life as an extra, without the slightest possibility of escaping this supporting role. How long he had already been in that state, Adam did not know. Panic dominated his tired mind when he heard his daughter say that they still had to search his trouser pockets for anything useful. Jasmine spoke with Abdul about him as if he were an object in a pawn shop. Around him there was busy activity, which came to a sudden end with the arrival of the village doctor. This man, whom they called Don Juan because of his secret passion for the nurse Donna Luisa, merely touched the paralyzed old man briefly on the neck and confirmed his death without any further examination. To spare his daughter any possible funeral costs, Adam had signed a contract years earlier with a medical university in the Basque Country and had bequeathed his body to the institute. He was to be used by students for anatomical dissection and, in return, afterward receive a proper burial. When the institute's hearse arrived and the old man was pushed into the prepared refrigerated compartment of the vehicle, he lost consciousness again. Adam came to as he was passing through customs control in Rio and walking toward the exit of the terminal. No one had noticed the money vest under his shirt, and a weight fell from his shoulders when he saw a sign with his name in the hands of a fat black man. Luis was the big man's name, and he looked anything but trustworthy. His enormous Hawaiian shirt was wet with sweat, and clung to his fat belly as if grown onto it. Sweat dripped from his chin as though his head had sprung a leak. An oversized paw almost crushed his hand, and Adam introduced himself to him. Everything went as arranged, and he would be able to carry out his part to the client's satisfaction. This client, whom everyone called only Frank, had approached him in Edzilla's carpentry shop a few months earlier and offered him this deal. Since Adam had separated from his wife Caroline and thus also from his children because he had fallen for a very young gypsy girl from Madrid, he was in constant financial distress. Not because he had to pay any kind of support, but because he had difficulty scraping together enough cash to provide for himself and the young gypsy girl Suina. Whenever he failed to bring in enough ready money, she earned ready money, and he went mad with jealousy at the very thought of it. Luis pulled Adam along with him and, as they walked to the car, told him that he was his bodyguard and was also responsible for all personal matters. Never in his life had the rundown artist felt as important as he did at that moment. The gigantic bodyguard then started his old Buick and drove off with his guest. Adam had no idea where the journey was taking him, but that was part of the arrangement. The two of them had been on the road for many hours. Little by little the houses grew fewer, the roads worse, and after they had driven through a gigantic slum, the journey ended on the bank of the Paraiba. A speedboat was already waiting there, and the journey continued upriver. Adam was fascinated by this adventure, and there seemed to be no risk to life and limb, so it was entirely to his taste. Overtired from jet lag, his eyes fell shut, and when the boat tied up at a small jetty somewhere in the jungle, he woke with a bear's hunger. While food was being cooked in the boathouse by an Indian family for the boat crew and their passengers, Luis prepared everything necessary for a march on foot. They ate quickly, and before dusk fell, the two set off. An hour later they reached a small airstrip, climbed into a twin-engine Cessna, and flew toward the clouds. Since his arrival in Rio de Janeiro, the fat man had talked at Adam like a chattering washerwoman, but had not asked a single question. The next morning the two adventurers woke when the small propeller plane touched down on a bumpy runway and came to a stop beside an old off-road vehicle. They hurriedly packed their bags and changed into the waiting vehicle. The driver did not say a word, started the engine and drove off. After only 2 hours of driving, they reached the bank of the Amazon, climbed into one of those long riverboats, and on they went. Adam had long since lost his orientation and had no idea where in Brazil he was. This trip, however, was entirely to his liking and lucrative besides, so why occupy himself with trivialities? In the evening the boat moored at the riverbank, and a beaming Frank warmly greeted Adam. The two disappeared into a small hut, and the vest with the money sewn into it changed owners. Adam was relieved, as though a 100-weight burden had released his shoulders. He left the hut to thank Luis, but the man had vanished. This morning was different. The girls' chatter, the screaming of the little children, and even the smell of fire and food were missing. The camp was empty, as if extinct. At the edge of the clearing, a hulking figure stomped out of the thicket and stood waiting. Frank rose from the breakfast table, gave a few agreed-upon signs, and ran toward the figure. The fat black man had reappeared, and with him a number of Indians. Suddenly, busy movement and tension lay in the air. The boat that had been tied up at the jetty since their arrival was loaded with packages and refueled. After Frank had checked the cargo, he called for Adam. Adam quickly packed his few things and boarded the boat with his friend. They cast off and disappeared into the green of the jungle. Several hours downstream, Frank's modern sailing boat was moored. They transferred and hid the hot goods in prepared compartments. Afterward the two sailed on until they reached the open sea. Now Adam's hour had come. He and Frank had known each other since their youth, were experienced skippers, and with their hot cargo on board, they set out on the return journey to Europe. They took the Atlantic route, although that passage was considerably harder to sail. During their voyage, they had hardly spent any time together. They sailed in shifts of 8 hours, and only at the change of watch was there an opportunity for a brief conversation, so strenuous was the tour. The salt water had attacked their skin in many places, and Adam complained of open eczema from which pus dripped. After almost 3 months, Ibiza came into sight. Without entering the harbour, Adam went overboard in the inflatable dinghy and rowed ashore. His fear of being caught with the hot goods in Spanish waters had grown too great. Frank did not agree with this conspicuous action, and a violent argument broke out. But the artist's nerves failed so close to the goal, nothing could keep him there any longer, and he wanted only to get ashore, away from the hot cargo and from his friend. They both agreed to meet a few days later in the harbour of Altea. A week later they met there in a café, drank a cortado, and spoke about what they had lived through. Frank was still hurt and fobbed off his former friend with a ridiculously small sum. Because of Adam's failure, he had had to rearrange several things, and the whole operation had been needlessly endangered. This small amount of money, however, would be enough for Adam for 2 or 3 years, and the past months had cost him nothing. Whatever the case, he thought secretly, he would live off this experience for years to come. So, a little dissatisfied, he drove home, bought himself a small bottle of wine, and got properly hammered. The stress had been tremendous, and he nodded off. The loud sound of the hearse door slamming shut tore him from his reveries. He was still lying on this wheeled stretcher, and was being pushed into an enormous cellar. He was terribly cold, and this very feeling gave him hope that he was slowly regaining control over himself. All through his body there was tingling, his breathing became deeper, and his eyelids twitched slightly. The drivers of the vehicle were in a side room, talking animatedly, while Adam unsteadily rose from his conveyance. A tag was tied to his right toe and hindered him as he walked. Awkwardly he opened the knot and threw it into a large laundry container. Only now did he feel completely alive again and flit through the corridors in his white burial gown. Adam had not drunk anything for many hours and began searching all the cupboards and side rooms. In doing so, he lost his way more and more in this vault, while the hearse driver parked his vehicle in a parking lot. No one had noticed the missing body. Since there had never been a vanished corpse at this university before, the responsible driver believed that his colleague had taken care of the rest of the work. The lights on the ceilings went out, and, flickering, the emergency lighting began its service, as it did every evening. Doors slammed loudly, and Adam heard keys being inserted into locks and everything being locked up. In his white gown, the old artist flitted silently through the corridors, barefoot, freezing, and still not properly clear in the head. It was his instinct that led him safely through this vault and allowed him to find the staff break room. Like a man dying of thirst, he swayed to the hand basin, turned on the tap, and while Adam bent down to drink, he saw out of the corner of his eye a bottle of wine in a half-open locker. Suddenly repelled by the smell of the water, he turned swiftly around and steered unerringly toward the cupboard. Adam felt at home. Everything had been prepared for him, and with a plop, the cork hissed out of the bottle and the wine into his mouth. Afterward he carefully put the empty bottle back, wiped his mouth with his sleeve and wandered on. The alcohol tightened his battered body, and gave Adam back strength and dignity. Buoyant with joy, he began to hop and twirl around himself, when he suddenly encountered a cleaner. The terrified woman let out a shrill scream, fell as if struck by lightning, and lay motionless. Like an apparition, Adam fluttered toward the woman, poked her soft side with his gnarled toes, and dragged her to her feet. She gasped a few confused words and lost consciousness again. Exhausted by his rescue operation, the old man stood there for a few seconds, turned around, and saw a mop flying toward him. It struck his face, made him tip backward, and everything went black. Adam hit his head hard on the cold stone floor. Blood dripped from his nose and ears, formed a small puddle, and seeped into a drain beside his head. The last thing the dying artist could see was the desperate face of a woman who had hurried to help her colleague and was now beginning to grasp the full extent of her rescue operation. Mop water dripped from the murder weapon into his open mouth and displaced the good taste of the red wine. The two women, responsible for cleanliness in this area, gathered up their cleaning equipment and set to work. Since the old man was in the way, they packed him onto a free stretcher and pushed it into the cold room. There they cleaned the now cold body and called the night watchman to report the incident. The night watchman was completely overwhelmed by the situation and alerted the director of the institution. It took less than an hour, and the Guardia Civil appeared in the company of the manager to clarify the situation. In painstaking detail, the course of events was reconstructed, and they came to the conclusion that the two ladies had gained access to the break room. There, they were convinced the women had stolen a bottle of wine from an open locker and got drunk. As a result of their intoxication, the two had suffered hallucinations, and their imagination had done the rest. Pleasantly surprised by this turn of events, the women readily admitted everything, and were more than satisfied with a written warning.